In the first week of August 1944, a 20-year-old lieutenant from Indiana climbed a rocky hill above the French town of Mortain, carrying a radio, a map, and a pair of binoculars. His name was Robert Weiss. He had been in combat for barely a week. Within 24 hours, German armored forces surrounded his hill, cut him off from every friendly unit, and attacked again and again for 6 days. Weiss and the infantrymen around him had no tanks, almost no working anti-tank guns, and dwindling food, water, and ammunition. What they had was that radio, and on the other end of it, the massed guns of American field artillery. Time after time, Weiss spoke a few dozen words into the handset, and minutes later, German assault columns disappeared under concentrated shell fire that he had summoned without asking permission from anyone above him. After the war, German officers writing for their former enemies rated American artillery as the deadliest thing they had faced in the West. But one part of it they never came to terms with: the speed. How did the shells arrive so fast, from so many guns at once, when no general seemed to have ordered them? The answer was not a secret weapon. It was something far harder to copy. And that is the story of this film. To understand why German officers found American artillery so difficult to answer, you have to start with a problem that every army carried out of the First World War. In that war, artillery was the great killer. Most battlefield deaths came from shell fire, not bullets, and the war's decisive battles opened with bombardments measured in millions of rounds. Yet, for all its power, artillery in 1918 was slow. Great bombardments were planned days or weeks in advance, written into timetables, registered gun by gun, and fired on schedule, whether the battle still matched the plan or not. The Germans themselves had produced the era's most admired refinement: short, precisely orchestrated hurricane bombardments that struck without long warning, but even those were the product of weeks of preparation by specialists. Once the infantry advanced past the edge of any plan, the guns fell silent or fired blind, and men died waiting for support that could not adjust to what was actually happening a few hundred meters in front of the observers. A general could command thousands of guns and still be unable to answer a simple, urgent question from a company commander. There are enemy tanks in front of me right now. Can someone shoot at them? Every serious army spent the interwar years trying to solve that problem. How do you make heavy firepower respond to a battlefield that changes by the minute without giving up the accuracy that makes firepower worth having? The German answer, broadly, was to go around the problem. German planners bet on speed of maneuver. Tanks with radios, motorized infantry, and dive bombers acting as flying artillery would break through before the enemy could set his guns. It was a brilliant bet, and in 1939, 1940, and 1941 it shattered armies across Europe. But it left German field artillery itself organized along fairly traditional lines. The guns were excellent. The gunners were superbly trained. The fire control methods, however, leaned heavily on telephone wire, on carefully prepared positions, and on authority concentrated in designated artillery commanders. And behind the panzer spearheads that filled the newsreels, the majority of German infantry divisions still moved their guns and ammunition the way armies had for centuries, with horses. The American answer came from an unlikely place: a cash-starved army post in Oklahoma. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the United States Army ranked among the smaller armies of the world, and budget cuts hampered nearly every modernization effort the Field Artillery School attempted. Officers taught with equipment left over from the last war and counted practice rounds the way misers count coins. It is one of the quiet ironies of the Second World War that the deadliest American ground warfare innovation was born not from abundance, but from poverty. Because when you cannot afford more guns, the only way to get more firepower is to use the guns you have more intelligently. At Fort Sill, home of the Field Artillery School, a small group of officers in the gunnery department quietly attacked the core problem. Major Carlos Brewer, who directed the department in the late 1920s and early 1930s, threw out the old method of massing fire by describing terrain features to each battery. His instructors introduced a firing chart, located every battery's position by precise survey, and designated targets in relation to a common reference point on that chart. In the spring of 1931, the department publicly demonstrated something armies had struggled with for a generation: the massed fire of an entire battalion brought together quickly onto a single target. Brewer's successor, Major Orlando Ward, took the next step and created the Fire Direction Center, a single cell at battalion level that centralized the mathematics of gunnery so that many guns could be controlled and massed as one. A third officer, Lieutenant Colonel H.L.C. Jones, refined the center and pushed it toward acceptance across the whole field artillery. Notice what these men were actually deciding. They were not designing a better gun. They were redesigning who does the thinking. Under the Fort Sill system, the battery, the traditional unit of artillery pride, the small kingdom of every battery commander since Napoleon, gave up its independent fire calculations. The battalion's Fire Direction Center did the math for everyone. That change was resisted, argued over in professional journals, and pushed forward only gradually through demonstrations and persistence. Centralizing computation looked to traditionalists like an insult to the gunner's craft. But once the math lived in one place, something transformative followed. The fire of 12 guns, or 48, or more than 100, could be aimed at one target as easily as the fire of 4, because massing fire was no longer a matter of coordinating proud, separate calculations, only of distributing one calculation to more barrels. Centralize the computation, decentralize the eyes. That single organizational idea, worked out with slide rules and survey stakes on a peacetime budget by officers whose names never made headlines, is the machine German officers would collide with in 1944. It matters because of a brutal piece of battlefield arithmetic. When two forces stumble into each other, the side that masses accurate fire first usually wins the fight, and first is measured in minutes. The Americans had spent a decade building an organization to win exactly that race. The question was whether it would work under fire. Here is how the system actually worked, stripped to its essentials, because the mechanism is the answer to this film's question. Forward observers, usually lieutenants or sergeants from the artillery battalions, moved with the infantry they supported. Each observer team carried a radio. When an observer saw a target, tanks assembling, infantry in the open, a battery firing, he did not aim any guns, and he did not ask any general. He sent a short, structured message to his battalion's Fire Direction Center, what the target was, where it was, and what he wanted done to it. In the Fire Direction Center, a team of specialists converted that location into firing data, the direction, elevation, and fuse settings, for every gun assigned to the mission, each from its own surveyed position. The guns fired. The observer watched the burst, sent a correction, and then called for fire for effect. From first call to shells on target, the process ran in minutes, and the Fire Direction Center could do something more. If the target justified it, the center passed the mission upward and sideways, and the fire of other battalions, division artillery, even corps artillery, joined in, all computed onto the same point. A standard American infantry division carried 4 artillery battalions of its own, 3 of 105mm howitzers and 1 of 155s, 48 guns before a single neighbor helped. Pause on what is missing from that chain of events, because its absence is the answer to our title. There is no request for permission in it. The observer does not own the guns and cannot even see them. He asks, and the Fire Direction Center, a captain with a chart, not a general with a headquarters, decides in seconds whether he gets one battery, one battalion, or everything within range. Authority flowed toward the man who could see the target. German commanders on the receiving end kept looking for the order from above that unleashed each avalanche of fire, because in their system, such fire implied deliberate, high-level planning. In the American system, there was often no such order to find. The avalanche was the routine response of a machine built to say yes quickly. The refinement that most impressed and horrified those on the receiving end was the technique called time on target. Because the fire direction system knew every battery's position and every shell's flight time, batteries firing from different locations could launch at staggered moments so that all of their first shells arrived in the same instant. No ranging rounds, no warning. 1 second of quiet, and the next, the impact of dozens or hundreds of shells simultaneously before anyone could take cover, which mattered because studies of shell fire had long shown that most casualties happen in the first seconds before men reach the ground or their holes. Historians of the Northwest Europe campaign consistently rank time on target, the massing of multiple battalions, and the tight link between observers and guns as the qualities that made American artillery superior to its German counterpart in almost every respect. The eyes multiplied too. In 1942, the War Department approved organic air observation for the field artillery. Light, slow, unarmed spotter planes flown by artillerymen themselves, orbiting over friendly lines and adjusting massed fire onto anything that moved. For German soldiers in the West, the little plane droning overhead became one of the most hated sights of the war, because its presence meant that starting a vehicle engine or bunching up on a road could summon a storm. Now put a human being inside this machine. Robert Weiss landed across Utah Beach on July 28, 1944, a 20-year-old lieutenant who had joined the Army the year before and was assigned as a forward observer in the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, supporting the 30th Infantry Division. On August 6th, he drove into the small town of Mortain with a 3-man team, then climbed to the summit of Hill 314, a rocky height whose observation dominated the only main road running west toward Avranches, the hinge of the entire American breakout from Normandy. By his own account, he spent that first day doing unglamorous preparation, plotting numbered barrages around the position so that fire could later be called by a single code word. Before dawn on August 7th, the Germans attacked. The 2nd SS Panzer Division struck in 2 columns around Mortain. Other formations joined. The American battalion command post in town was overrun, and roughly 700 men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, were sealed off on the hill under Captain Reynold Eriksson, the senior surviving officer. With them sat 2 forward observer teams from the 230th, led by Lieutenant Charles Bartz and Lieutenant Weiss, looking straight down onto every German vehicle that tried to use the road below. For 6 days, that observation post functioned as the trigger of the American artillery system. Weiss's team worked with a single radio running on dying batteries, at times the one fragile thread connecting the hill to the outside, and through it they called down fire mission after fire mission on assaulting infantry, on vehicle columns, on gun positions, breaking attack after attack that the surrounded riflemen, armed with little heavier than bazookas and mortars, could never have stopped alone. On the afternoon of the first day, when a German assault came at G Company's sector out of the town itself behind white phosphorus shells, Weiss found cover from the burning fragments and answered by calling a mission onto a group of enemy howitzers. The pattern repeated for days. The Germans probed, massed, and attacked. The observers on the summit turned every visible concentration into a target. Resupply from outside kept failing. An attempt to reach the hill with 2 light spotter planes packed with food was driven off by German fire. So the gunners of the 230th improvised, firing shell casings packed with medical supplies onto the hilltop, while radio batteries, the most precious cargo of all, could not be replaced at all. A junior lieutenant, 2 weeks into combat, rationing the electricity that kept his voice alive, was directing the concentrated firepower of an army because the system had been built, from the ground up, to let him. By now, you can see the basic answer to our title. The speed came from an organization, not a weapon. But if the machine was this good, an obvious question follows. Why didn't it simply sweep the German army aside everywhere it fired? The record of 1943 and 1944 gives an uncomfortable answer. The men of the 230th Field Artillery and the riflemen they protected on Hill 314 earned their place in this story with 6 days nobody should forget. If this account kept their stand visible for a new audience, a like on this video helps keep stories like theirs from fading. The first hard limit showed itself in North Africa at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, in the U.S. Army's first major collision with veteran German forces. American artillery was present, and the Fort Sill methods were already doctrine. The Fire Direction Center had been standard for years. The manuals were written, the training was done. It did not matter enough. Inexperienced American units were spread thin across too much ground. Positions were poorly sighted and mutually unsupporting. And when the German attack came through the pass, observation collapsed along with the front. Batteries were overrun or forced into retreat along with everyone else. Guns were lost, and thousands of American soldiers marched into captivity. The lesson was blunt, and American commanders absorbed it in public humiliation. A fire direction center can mass shells with brilliant speed, but it cannot rescue an army that is out of position, cannot create observation where the front has dissolved, and cannot see through confusion. The system amplified good tactics. It could not substitute for them. Yet the same campaign showed how fast the machine rewarded learning. Only 6 weeks later, at El Guetar in Tunisia, better-sighted American infantry, backed by massed, well-directed artillery, met armored attacks by the veteran 10th Panzer Division head-on and broke them. Same army, same doctrine, same guns. Different result, because this time the eyes and the positions held. The system was never a substitute for soldiering. It was a multiplier of it in both directions. The second limit was human and fragile. Everything depended on the observer and his radio. A handful of men, far forward with the rifle companies, carrying equipment that marked them as priority targets for every German sniper and mortar crew who understood what an antenna meant, and powered by batteries that ran down at the worst possible moments. On Hill 314, the difference between salvation and silence was literally the charge remaining in Weiss's radio batteries. When airdrops failed, batteries could not be fired onto the hill inside a shell casing the way bandages could. Forward observation ranked among the most dangerous jobs in the ground war, with casualty rates to match, and battalions trained replacement observers continuously because they expected to need them. When observers went down or communications failed, the fastest artillery system in the world went blind, and blind, it was no better than the timetable artillery of 1918. The Americans had not eliminated the old vulnerability. They had concentrated it into a few irreplaceable men and a few pounds of electronics. The third limit is the one most viewers have never heard of. In the autumn of 1944, the most lavishly supplied army on Earth nearly ran out of shells. The U.S. Army's own official supply history is unambiguous on this point. It records that the ammunition shortage, more than any other factor, determined the character of American operations in October 1944. Along most of the front held by American forces that month, activity stayed deliberately light. Apart from the fight that took Aachen and minor probing attacks, the armies simply could not afford to shoot. General Omar Bradley concluded that major offensives were out of the question until minimum reserves were reconstituted and a steady flow of ammunition assured. And this was not a sudden crisis. The First Army had imposed its first artillery ammunition rationing as early as June 15th, barely 9 days after the Normandy landings, and the problem waxed and waned all the way to Germany. It bit hardest in General Patton's Third Army, which in the worst October weeks operated under the severest restrictions of any American army in Europe. Even in the first months of 1945, official figures show 105 mm howitzer supply averaging on the order of 30 rounds per gun per day against a desired 45, with heavier calibers proportionally worse off. The bottleneck was not American factories, which were producing at enormous scale. It was the broken logistics chain trying to haul thousands of tons of shells daily from distant ports and beaches to guns that had advanced hundreds of miles faster than any plan had assumed. So hold both facts at once. The artillery system German soldiers described as inexhaustible spent whole months on short rations, and American infantrymen paid the difference in blood during the grinding autumn battles along the German frontier. And there was a fourth limit: terrain that blinded the eyes. In the Hurtgen forest that same autumn, American divisions fought for months through dense, dripping woods where observers could see 50 meters instead of 5 kilometers, where map locations dissolved into identical fire breaks and ravines, and where the numbered concentrations and time-on-target strikes that had shattered German attacks in open Normandy lost much of their meaning. Worse, the forest handed the Germans an equalizer of their own. Shells fused to burst in the treetops, sprayed wood splinters and steel down into foxholes, punishing men who had been taught that getting flat on the ground made them safe. In the forest, the American artillery advantage shrank towards something closer to equality, and the casualty lists of the divisions fed into the Hurtgen showed exactly what that cost. So, the honest picture, entering the last winter of the war, is not a wonder weapon. It is a brilliant organization with visible seams, helpless against bad tactics, dependent on fragile men and batteries, capable of being starved, and blindable by terrain. The Germans, meanwhile, were not standing still. They were studying this system with professional attention, and what they concluded, and what they did about it, is where this story turns. Start with the claim in our title, because the record deserves precision. Did German officers truly fail to explain American artillery? After the war, the U.S. Army's Historical Division put hundreds of former German generals and staff officers to work writing studies of the campaigns they had fought, a program known as the Foreign Military Studies. Read across those manuscripts and the interrogation reports that preceded them, and a consistent judgment emerges. American artillery is singled out again and again as the arm the Germans respected most, and its speed of response, its observation, and its ammunition supply are named as the reasons. In other words, German professionals could describe the machine accurately. There is also a story American gunners loved to repeat, that captured Germans asked about the automatic artillery because the fire arrived too fast and too thick to come from ordinary guns. That story appears in many retellings, but is hard to trace to a single wartime document, so treat it as a soldier's legend that captures a real psychological truth rather than a verified quotation. What German officers could not do was copy the system, and here their own circumstances wrote the explanation for them. Follow the requirements backward, one by one. The American method needed radios in depth, down to every observer team, every spotter plane, every battalion net, while German artillery fire control leaned heavily on telephone wire, which shell fire cut at exactly the moments it mattered most, in an economy that could not spare radios on anything close to the American scale. It needed motor transport to shift guns quickly and haul enormous daily tonnages of shells, while the majority of German infantry divisions relied on horse-drawn transport to the end of the war, a fact that surprises many viewers, because the newsreel image of the Panzer Army has always hidden the horse-drawn reality behind it. It needed ammunition in oceans, while German batteries fought under strict rationing imposed by bombed factories, wrecked railways, and a three-front war. By 1944, a German battery commander often counted his daily allotment in a handful of rounds per gun. It needed freedom to concentrate guns and move in daylight, while Allied fighter bombers made massed German battery positions and daytime road movement close to suicidal in the West, forcing dispersion, camouflage discipline, and night marches that slowed every German response by hours. And it needed one more thing that is easy to miss because it is invisible: an institutional decision made years earlier and drilled into thousands of men to let very junior soldiers trigger the fire of entire divisions on their own judgment. German fire planning concentrated that authority in designated artillery commanders and their staffs, a rational system for a wire and horse army, and precisely the orders from above our title describes. Rebuilding doctrine, communications, transport, training, and trust around the American model in the middle of a losing war was not a reform. It would have been a reinvention, and no army reinvents itself while bleeding. So the German army adapted the way soldiers always adapt, moving at night, digging deeper, hugging American positions so closely that defensive fire risked falling on both sides, sheltering on reverse slopes, and learning to keep engines silent when the little spotter plane was overhead. These measures reduced the pain. They never removed it, and every German veteran account of the Western Front carries the scar of that fact. Then, in December 1944, the gap widened again. For months, the Allies had been sitting on a secret: the VT proximity fuse, a miniature radio transmitter and receiver built into the nose of an artillery shell, rugged enough to survive being fired from a gun, that sensed the approaching ground and detonated the shell in the air above it. Instead of burying its blast in mud or snow, a proximity-fused shell burst roughly 30 to 50 feet up and swept the area below with fragments, reaching men in open foxholes and slit trenches that ordinary impact fuses could not touch. The device had been used at sea against aircraft since early 1943, but commanders had forbidden its use over land in Europe, fearing that a dud would fall into German hands and be copied or countered. The plan was to release it for ground combat around Christmas 1944. The German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, began on December 16th and overtook the schedule. Within days of the attack, the embargo was lifted, and gunners who had trained with the fuse in secret put it to work against German columns moving in the open. Near Echternach, 3rd Army Artillery caught German troops crossing the Sauer River with a battalion concentration of the new shells. General Patton reported the count of the dead at just over 700 from that single concentration, and later wrote that the funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. Historians rightly push back on that claim. The Bulge was decided by American resistance at 100 crossroads, by German fuel shortages, by weather and logistics, and the fuse reached the fight only as the battle matured. But its effect on the men beneath it is well documented. American intelligence reported German commanders offering rewards to soldiers who recovered an intact fuse from a dud, and prisoners repeatedly described the night airbursts as uniquely demoralizing because darkness and dispersal, the two shields German troops had learned to trust against American artillery, no longer protected them. The system this film has described now delivered shells that were not just fast, they were smart, and the two German counters of choice had just been taken away in the same month. Many families watching carry a piece of this story. If your father, grandfather, or another relative served in an artillery unit, American, German, or any army? Tell us in the comments which unit and which front, if you know it. Those details, added together, keep this history precise. So rank the causes, because the Americans had good artillery explains nothing by itself. First, and above everything, came organization and doctrine. The Fire Direction Center and the decision it embodied. Centralize the computation of fire at battalion level and push the authority to demand that fire outward to whoever could see the enemy. This was the engine, and it explains the specific thing German officers kept marveling at: the absence of visible orders from above. There were no such orders because the doctrine had replaced them with a standing order, written years earlier in Oklahoma, that said, in effect, "The man who sees the target speaks for the army." It was invented in peacetime, on a shoestring, by officers whose names almost nobody knows: Brewer, Ward, Jones, and every other advantage in this ranking flowed through their idea. Second came communications. Radios in every observer team, radios in the spotter planes, nets linking battalions to divisions to corps artillery made the doctrine physically real. Without them, a fire direction center is a tent full of arithmetic. With them, it became a nervous system running the length of the front, and it is exactly here, in radios per unit and in links that shell fire could not cut the way it cut telephone wire, that the German army was poorest. Take away the American radios and the whole edifice collapses back into 1918. Third came trust, the cultural ingredient, and the hardest to see in any archive. The United States Army handed the keys of its most destructive conventional arm to 20-year-old lieutenants and career sergeants, then built training standardized enough across hundreds of battalions to make that delegation safe rather than reckless. When Robert Weiss called fire on Hill 314, no one above him vetted the request. The system's speed was purchased with confidence given in advance. German officers could admire that arrangement, and some clearly did. Their institution, fighting for survival with shrinking resources, could not adopt it mid-war. You cannot install trust by directive. Fourth came logistics and scale: shells, trucks, guns, and replacement radios in quantities Germany could not begin to answer, delivered across an ocean. This mattered enormously, and no honest account minimizes it. But the autumn famine of 1944 proved that abundance was an amplifier, not the engine. The system built its terrifying reputation partly in months when it was firing on strict rations. Scale made the machine overwhelming. It did not make the machine. Fifth, and only fifth, came technology. The light spotter planes overhead from 1942, and the proximity fuse from December 1944. Both multiplied the machine's power, and the fuse in particular stripped away the last German counters of night and open field dispersal. Neither created the machine. German soldiers feared American artillery long before either one mattered, which is precisely why ranking them first, as popular history sometimes does, gets the story backward. Set the ranking against the title one final time. German officers could explain every piece of this, and after the war, many of them did at length, in studies written for the army that had defeated them. What they could never explain away was the gap between understanding and replication. Why an army with guns as good and gunners as brave never made its shells arrive that fast, that massed, that reliably. The answer was never hidden in the gun pits. It sat in a tent with a chart and a radio net, inside an institution willing to bet everything on the judgment of the man who could see the target. Which returns us, finally, to the hill above Mortain. The siege of Hill 314 ended on August 12, 1944, when American forces fought their way through to the survivors. The cost was staggering for a single battalion position. By the National Museum's account, more than half of the roughly 700 men on the hill had been killed or wounded, and decades later, the 30th Infantry Division's stand there was recognized with a Presidential Unit citation. Strategically, the arithmetic was simple and enormous. The road to Avranches never fell. The German counteroffensive at Mortain, an attack meant to cut the American breakout in half, collapsed against a defense whose backbone was observed, massed artillery fire, and the armored divisions committed to it were left dangerously deep inside a closing Allied trap in Normandy, from which many of their men and few of their vehicles would escape. A reasonable case can be made, and historians have made it, that the radio on Hill 314 was among the most consequential single pieces of equipment in the entire Normandy campaign. Weiss came down the hill, kept his fire mission notes, and more than half a century later published his account so that the record of those 6 days would exist in his own words, alongside the surviving fire direction logs. The observation post where he and Lieutenant Bartz worked, their dying radio still overlooks that road, marked today by a memorial chapel on the summit. The verdict of this film is not that America won by machinery alone, and not that German soldiers failed for lack of skill or courage. It is narrower and better supported. In the specific contest of putting steel on a target fast, one army had spent 15 quiet years rebuilding who does the thinking, and the other discovered, at places like Mortain, that this invisible choice was the hardest weapon of the war to counter, because you cannot capture an idea the way you capture a gun. If evidence-based history like this is worth your time, a like and a subscription are the simplest way to keep this kind of remembrance going, and to tell us to research the next story to the same standard. Somewhere in an archive, the fire mission logs of 100 forgotten battalions are still waiting to be read. The guns are long silent. The thinking that aimed them still speaks.